Frank Sinatra broke down the night. Dean Martin walked away. His words still haunt. Hollywood. The rehearsal studio at Bally's Las Vegas was empty, except for two men who'd performed together for nearly 40 years. It was March 1988, and Frank Sinatra, 72 years old, still commanding stages though his voice had lost some of its legendary power, stood at center stage watching Dean Martin pack up his belongings. "Dino, don't do this." Frank's voice was quiet, stripped of the usual swagger. "We can work this out. Whatever's wrong, we can fix it." Dean didn't turn around. He just kept methodically placing his sheet music in his leather case. His movements slow and deliberate, like a man who'd made a decision and was seeing it through despite the cost. "There's nothing to fix, Frank. I'm just done." "Done? What the hell does that mean, done?" Frank's voice rose, frustration bleeding through. "We've got 18 cities booked, sold-out shows. People are paying good money to see us. To see us pretend." Dean finally turned, and Frank was shocked by what he saw in his friend's face. Dean looked old, not just aged, but tired in a way that went beyond physical exhaustion. His eyes, which had sparkled with that famous easy humor for decades, were flat and empty. "To see us pretend we're still those guys from the Sands, from the Copa Room, from when we were young and everything was possible and we owned the goddamn world. We can still give them a show." "I can't, Frank." Dean's voice was firm but not angry, just final. "I can't pretend anymore. I can't get up on that stage and play Dean Martin when Dean Martin died with my son." The reference to Dean Paul, killed in a plane crash 9 months earlier, hung in the air between them like smoke. Frank had tried to help Dean through his grief, had done what Frank always did when someone he loved was hurting. He'd tried to fix it, to solve it, to push through it with sheer force of will. He'd convinced Dean to sign on for this tour, had told him that performing would help, that staying busy would heal him. He'd been wrong. "Dino, I know you're hurting. I know losing Dean Paul was—" Frank struggled for words adequate to describe that kind of loss. "But walking away from everything, from performing, from your career, that's not going to bring him back." "I know that." Dean's voice was gentle, patient, in a way that somehow made everything worse. "Frank, I'm not walking away to bring him back. I'm walking away because I can't breathe up there anymore. Can't find the lightness, the joy, the whatever it was that made people love watching us. It died when Dean Paul died, and I can't resurrect it just because you need me to." "I don't need you to—" "Yes, you do." Dean moved closer, and for the first time, Frank could see tears in his friend's eyes. "Frank, you've always needed me to be the easy one, the one who made it look effortless, the one who could make you laugh when you were taking everything too seriously. But I don't have that anymore. I don't have the energy to be Dean Martin for you or for anyone else. I just want to be Dean. Just be a father who lost his son. Just be a man who's tired and wants to go home. This tour, Dino, I can't do it without you." "You can. You've done plenty without me." "Not like this. Not the Together Again tour. The whole point is us together. You and me. The way it's always been." Dean smiled sadly. "The way it's always been is over, Frank. It ended when Dean Paul's plane went down. I just didn't have the strength to admit it until now." Frank felt panic rising in his chest, a feeling he recognized but hadn't experienced in years. It was the same feeling he'd had when his voice had failed in the early 50s, when his career had collapsed and he'd thought he was finished. The feeling of losing control, of watching something precious slip away and being powerless to stop it. "Please." The word came out barely above a whisper. "Please don't walk away from this. From me." Dean looked at Frank for a long moment, and Frank could see the struggle in his friend's face, the part of Dean that wanted to stay, that wanted to give Frank what he needed, fighting against the part that knew staying would destroy what was left of him. "I'm sorry, Frank. I really am. But I have to go." Dean picked up his case and walked toward the door. Frank stood frozen, unable to process that this was actually happening. That Dean Martin, his best friend, his partner, his brother in everything but blood, was actually leaving. At the door, Dean paused and turned back. "Frank, you should walk away too. We've had incredible careers. We've accomplished more than we ever dreamed. We don't have anything left to prove. Why don't you just let it be enough? Let what we've done be enough and go home?" "I can't." Frank's voice was thick with emotion. "I don't know how to not be Frank Sinatra. I know. That's what I'm afraid of." Dean's expression was heartbroken. "Take care of yourself, Frank. Please, take care of yourself." And then he was gone, the door closing behind him with a soft click that sounded to Frank like the end of the world. Frank stood alone in that empty rehearsal studio for a long time, maybe minutes, maybe an hour. He couldn't have said. Time seemed to have stopped, or maybe it was moving too fast. He couldn't tell which. Eventually, Frank walked to the piano at the edge of the stage and sat down heavily. His hands were shaking. His heart was pounding. He felt like he was having a heart attack, but he knew he wasn't. This was something worse. This was the feeling of losing the person who understood him better than anyone, the person who'd been there through everything, the person who'd made the last 40 years bearable. Frank put his head in his hands and, for the first time in longer than he could remember, he let himself cry. Not the few tears he'd shed at Sammy's funeral or other emotional moments. Real crying. The kind that came from somewhere deep and primal and hurt so much, he wondered if it would ever stop. "Why?" Frank whispered to the empty room. "Why would you leave me now? After everything? After all these years?" But he knew why. He'd known it even as he'd been arguing with Dean, even as he'd been trying to convince him to stay. Dean was broken in a way that performing couldn't fix, broken in a way that Frank's legendary force of will couldn't fix, broken in a way that meant he had to walk away or die trying to keep performing. And Frank, selfish, desperate, terrified Frank, had tried to make him stay anyway. The door to the rehearsal studio opened. Jilly Rizzo, Frank's closest friend and bodyguard, walked in and stopped when he saw Frank's condition. "Jesus, Frank." Jilly moved quickly to Frank's side. "What happened? Where's Dean?" "He's gone." Frank's voice was hollow. "He quit. He's done. He's not doing the tour." Jilly was quiet for a moment. "Frank, I'm sorry. I know how much this meant to you." "It's not about the tour." Frank's anger flared, sudden and hot. "It's about—" He stopped, unable to articulate what it was really about. How could he explain that losing Dean felt like losing a part of himself? That for 40 years, Dean had been the one constant in Frank's chaotic life, the one person who could calm him down, make him laugh, remind him not to take everything so goddamn seriously. "It's about losing my best friend," Frank finally said, his voice breaking. "It's about watching Dean walk away and knowing I can't follow him, can't do what he's doing, can't just decide it's enough and go home." Jilly sat down beside Frank. "Why not? Why can't you do what Dean's doing?" "Because I don't know how to be anything else." The words burst out of Frank with desperate intensity. "Being Frank Sinatra is all I know. It's all I've ever known. Take that away, and what's left? Just Francis Albert from Hoboken who never amounted to anything." "That's not true." "It is true," Frank insisted. "Dean can walk away because Dean never needed the performance the way I do. He could take it or leave it. It was just a job for him, just something he did. But for me," Frank's voice caught, "for me, it's everything. It's who I am. And without Dean there to make it bearable, to remind me why we're doing it, to make me laugh when I want to throw something, I don't know if I can do it anymore." "Then don't. Take Dean's advice. Call off the tour. Retire. Go spend time with your family." Frank shook his head. I can't. I need this. Need to be on stage. Need to hear the applause. Need to know that Frank Sinatra still matters. Because if I'm not Frank Sinatra, if I'm just Francis Albert, then what was the point of any of it? What was the point of sacrificing everything, hurting everyone, building this empire, if I can't even enjoy it? Jilly didn't have an answer for that. They sat in silence, Frank crying quietly, Jilly simply being present in the way a true friend does. Eventually, Frank stood, wiped his eyes, straightened his jacket. The armor was going back on, piece by piece. The vulnerable man who'd broken down was being locked away again behind the image of Frank Sinatra. I need a drink, Frank said, his voice rough but controlled. And then I need to figure out how to salvage this tour. Frank, maybe you should take some time. No. Frank's voice was firm now, the decision made. Dean can walk away if that's what he needs, but I can't. I won't. So I'm going to finish this tour. I'm going to find someone to replace Dean. Replace Dean? Jilly sounded shocked. Frank, you can't replace... I can and I will. Liza Minnelli. She's talented, she's reliable, she can hold an audience. I'll call her tonight. The Together Again tour becomes the ultimate event, or whatever the hell the promoters want to call it. And we move forward. Jilly studied Frank's face, seeing the determination there, but also seeing something else, a kind of desperate denial, a refusal to acknowledge what Dean's departure really meant. Frank, don't do this out of anger. Don't do this to prove something. I'm not proving anything. I'm being professional. I have commitments, obligations, people who've bought tickets expecting to see a show, and they're going to get one, with or without Dean Martin. But even as Frank said it, even as he projected confidence and control, Jilly could see the cracks in the armor. Could see that Frank was barely holding himself together, was using anger and determination to avoid processing the grief of losing his best friend. Come on, Frank said, heading toward the door. Let's get out of this place. It's depressing as hell. As they left the rehearsal studio, Frank paused at the threshold and looked back. He could see Dean's silhouette in his mind, see all the rehearsals and performances and moments they'd shared in spaces like this over the decades, see the laughter and the arguments and the brotherhood that had sustained them both. I hope you find what you're looking for, Dino, Frank whispered. I hope walking away gives you peace, but I can't follow you. I can't stop being this, even if it kills me. The story of Dean Martin walking away from the tour spread through Hollywood within hours. Reactions were mixed. Some people understood. Dean had lost his son, was clearly grieving, needed to step away. Others were angry. Professionals don't quit in the middle of commitments, don't leave their partners hanging, don't abandon ship when people are counting on you. Frank's reaction became legendary. He replaced Dean with Liza Minnelli and carried on with the tour as planned. He never publicly criticized Dean, never complained about being abandoned. He simply moved forward with the relentless determination that had characterized his entire career. But those close to Frank saw the truth, saw how he'd been fundamentally altered by Dean's departure, saw how he'd become harder, more brittle, more desperate to prove that Frank Sinatra didn't need anyone. Nancy Sinatra Jr., Frank's daughter, visited him a week after Dean's departure. She found her father in his Palm Springs compound, drinking alone by the pool at 2 in the morning. Dad? Nancy's voice was gentle. What are you doing out here? Frank looked up, and Nancy was shocked by his expression. He looked lost in a way she'd rarely seen, like a child who'd been left alone and didn't know what to do. Can't sleep, Frank said. Keep thinking about... He stopped, unable or unwilling to finish the sentence. Nancy sat down beside him. About Dean? Frank nodded. I keep replaying it. The things he said, the things I said, wondering if I could have said something different. Done something different. Convinced him to stay. Dad, Dean made his choice. You couldn't have changed his mind. Maybe, but I should have understood sooner. Should have seen how much pain he was in. Should have... Frank's voice broke. Should have been a better friend. Should have told him it was okay to walk away, that I understood. That I'd miss him, but I wanted him to do what he needed to do. Why didn't you? Frank was quiet for a long time. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. Because I was terrified. Terrified that if Dean could walk away, could choose peace over performing, could decide that being himself was more important than being Dean Martin, then maybe I should be doing the same thing. And I can't. I can't walk away. I need this too much. Need the stage and the applause and the validation that Frank Sinatra still matters. Nancy felt tears forming. Dad, you don't need... Yes, I do, Frank interrupted, his voice intense. I need it like I need oxygen, like I need water. Being Frank Sinatra is all I have. It's all I am. And watching Dean walk away from being Dean Martin, it terrified me. Because if he can do it, if he can just decide he's done and go home and be at peace, then what's wrong with me that I can't do the same thing? Nothing's wrong with you. You're just different people with different needs. Or maybe I'm just more of a coward. Frank took a long drink. Maybe Dean's braver than I am. Brave enough to face life without the performance. Brave enough to be just himself, just Dean, without the armor of fame and success. And I'm too scared to do that. Too scared to find out who Francis Albert is without Frank Sinatra to hide behind. Nancy had never heard her father speak like this, so vulnerable and self-aware and devastated. Dad, Dean isn't walking away because he's brave. He's walking away because his grief is so overwhelming that he can't perform through it. That's not the same as choosing peace over performing. Isn't it? Frank looked at her. Dean said his son's death killed the part of him that could perform, killed Dean Martin the entertainer. And instead of trying to resurrect that, instead of pushing through like I would have done, he's choosing to honor that death. To let Dean Martin die and let Dean live. That takes courage I don't have. Or maybe it's just different. Maybe neither choice is braver or more cowardly. Maybe they're just different ways of dealing with grief and pain and the complications of fame. Frank smiled slightly. When did you get so wise? I learned from my father, even when he doesn't give himself enough credit. They sat together in silence, father and daughter, while the desert night stretched around them and the stars wheeled overhead. Frank completed the tour with Liza Minnelli. The shows were successful by most measures: sold-out venues, enthusiastic audiences, strong reviews. But everyone who knew Frank could see the difference. Could see that something essential was missing. The easy chemistry he'd had with Dean, the way they'd played off each other, made each other better. That couldn't be replicated. Liza was talented and professional, but she wasn't Dean. Could never be Dean. And Frank knew it. Every night on stage, every performance, Frank felt Dean's absence like a missing limb. He'd set up jokes expecting Dean to be there to complete them. He'd turn to share a moment only to remember Dean wasn't there anymore. The muscle memory of 40 years of partnership kept betraying him, kept reminding him what he'd lost. After the final show of the tour, Frank's manager found him alone in his dressing room, still in his performance tuxedo, staring at his reflection in the mirror. "Great show, Frank. The audience loved it." Frank didn't respond. He just kept staring at his reflection, and his manager realized Frank wasn't seeing himself. He was seeing the empty space where Dean should have been. "Frank, you know what the worst part is?" Frank's voice was distant, contemplative. "The worst part is that I understand why he left. I understand that he couldn't do it anymore, that the grief was too much, that staying would have destroyed him. I understand all of that intellectually. But emotionally? Emotionally, I feel abandoned, betrayed, left behind. Like 40 years of friendship meant so little that he could just walk away without looking back. I don't think Dean walked away from your friendship. He walked away from performing. "It's the same thing," Frank said. "Our friendship was built on performing together. The Rat Pack, the shows, the tours, that was how we expressed our friendship. And now that he's chosen peace over performing, chosen being Dean over being Dean Martin, where does that leave our friendship? Where does that leave me? You could call him, go visit him. Maintain the friendship outside of performing." Frank laughed bitterly. "And say what? Hey, Dino, I know you chose peace and I chose to keep destroying myself for applause, but we can still be friends? How do you maintain a friendship when you've made such fundamentally different choices about what matters?" His manager didn't have an answer. They stood in silence, Frank still staring at his reflection, seeing not the chairman of the board, but just Francis Albert, older, tired, and more alone than he'd been in 40 years. Frank and Dean spoke only occasionally in the years that followed. Brief phone calls, always awkward, always carrying the weight of everything unsaid between them. Frank performing until his voice and health wouldn't allow it anymore. Dean retreating further into solitude, choosing privacy and peace over the demands of public life. When Dean died in 1995, Frank was too ill to attend the funeral. He sent flowers and a simple card. "You were right, Dino. I should have walked away with you. Love, Frank." Those words, "You were right, Dino. I should have walked away with you," became legendary in Hollywood circles. They represented Frank Sinatra's ultimate admission, that Dean Martin had been brave enough to choose himself over his image, had been wise enough to know when to stop, had been strong enough to walk away from everything they'd built together because staying would have destroyed him. And Frank had lacked that courage, had kept performing until his body and voice gave out, had kept chasing the validation of strangers instead of finding peace in himself, had kept being Frank Sinatra long after Francis Albert was begging to rest. In his final years, when Frank's health was failing and he rarely performed anymore, he would sometimes talk about Dean, about the night Dean walked away, about what Dean had said, about what Frank had said in response. "He told me I should walk away too," Frank told one interviewer in 1996, his voice raspy with age. "Told me we'd done enough, accomplished enough, that we didn't have anything left to prove, and I told him I couldn't stop being Frank Sinatra, that I didn't know how to be anything else. Do you wish you'd listened to him?" Frank was quiet for a long time. "I wish I'd been brave enough to try." Dean walked into the unknown, into being just himself without the performance, and I was too scared to follow him. I kept performing because being Frank Sinatra was safe. I knew how to do that. Being just Francis Albert? That terrified me. "Do you regret that choice?" "I regret that I let fear make my decisions. I regret that I valued the applause of strangers more than the wisdom of my best friend. I regret—" Frank's voice caught. "I regret that the last real conversation Dean and I had, I was trying to convince him to stay for my sake, for my needs, my fears, instead of telling him I understood, that I supported him, that I was proud of him for being brave enough to choose peace. If you could talk to him now, what would you say?" Frank looked out the window of his Beverly Hills home, his eyes distant. "I'd say, you were right, Dino. You were right to walk away, right to choose yourself over the performance, right to decide that being Dean was more important than being Dean Martin. And I'm sorry I couldn't see that then. Sorry I couldn't support you the way you needed me to. Sorry I let my own fears make me selfish." And what do you think he'd say back? Frank smiled slightly. He'd probably say, "I forgive you, Pally. You did what you had to do, and I did what I had to do. And maybe neither choice was wrong, just different." That's how Dean was. No judgment, no anger, just understanding. Frank Sinatra died on May 14, 1998, at age 82. His last years had been marked by declining health, sporadic performances, and an increasing awareness that the end was near. But according to those closest to him, Frank never made peace with Dean's departure, never fully accepted that their friendship had fundamentally changed when Dean chose to walk away from performing. At Frank's funeral, Many people spoke about his achievements, his legendary career, his impact on music and entertainment, but it was Frank's daughter Tina who spoke about the night Dean walked away. "My father never recovered from losing Dean," Tina said, her voice carrying through the church. Not losing him to death. They were both still alive for years after Dean quit performing, but losing him to a different choice, a different path. "My father couldn't understand how Dean could walk away from everything they'd built. Couldn't understand how Dean could choose peace over performing. And that incomprehension haunted Dad for the rest of his life." Tina paused, collecting herself. "The night Dean walked away, my father broke down. Really broke down in a way few people ever saw. And he said something to Jilly Rizzo, something Jilly shared with us years later. Dad said, 'Without Dean, I'm just a man yelling songs at strangers. With Dean, I was part of something bigger. I was part of a friendship, a brotherhood, a connection that made all of this mean something. And now he's gone, and I'm alone with my fear that none of this was ever real.'" The words hung in the air of the church, and many of the attendees, people who'd known Frank, who'd worked with him, who'd witnessed his legendary career, felt the truth of them. Frank Sinatra, for all his success and fame and achievement, had been terrified of being alone. Terrified that without the connections, to Dean, to Sammy, to the Rat Pack, he was just a scared kid from Hoboken performing for the applause of strangers. And when Dean walked away, choosing peace over partnership, Frank had been left with the thing he'd feared most, facing his own demons without his best friend there to help him laugh them away. The story of the night Dean Martin walked away from Frank Sinatra has become part of Hollywood legend. It's been told and retold, analyzed and mythologized, turned into metaphor and meaning. But at its core, it's a simple story about friendship and choice, and the different ways people cope with pain and aging, and the realization that nothing lasts forever. Dean Martin chose peace, chose to honor his grief by walking away from the performance, chose to be just Dean rather than continue being Dean Martin the entertainer. Frank Sinatra chose performance, chose to keep being Frank Sinatra until his body gave out, chose the applause and the stage and the validation of strangers over the quiet peace Dean had found. Neither choice was wrong. Neither man was more courageous than the other. They were just different people with different needs, making different choices about how to spend their final years. But the night Dean walked away changed Frank forever. It exposed the fear he'd been running from his entire life, the fear of being just himself, just Francis Albert, without the armor of fame and performance to protect him. And Frank never recovered from that exposure, never found a way to be at peace with being ordinary. Never learned what Dean had learned, that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is choose yourself over your image, peace over applause, being over-performing. Frank's words to Dean, "I don't know how to not be Frank Sinatra," haunt Hollywood not because they were dramatic or poetic, but because they were true. And because that truth, that inability to separate self from performance, identity from image, is something many entertainers understand, but few admit. Dean Martin walked away and found peace. Frank Sinatra stayed and found applause. And the question that haunts Hollywood still, decades after both men died, is this: which man made the braver choice? Which man understood what really mattered? Which man lived better in those final years? The answer, perhaps, is that both men did what they needed to do to survive. Dean needed peace. Frank needed performance. And the tragedy wasn't that they made different choices. The tragedy was that those different choices meant their friendship couldn't survive intact. Because at the end of the day, what Frank lost when Dean walked away wasn't just a performance partner. It was the person who understood him best, who'd been there through everything, who'd made the loneliness of fame bearable, and nothing, not the sold-out shows, not the accolades, not the legend of Frank Sinatra, could replace that loss. The end. Author's note: this story is a work of fiction inspired by real events. Dean Martin did walk away from a 1988 tour with Frank Sinatra, and their friendship was strained in the final years of their lives. Dean's son, Dean Paul, did die in a plane crash in 1987, and Dean did largely retire from public life afterward. Frank did continue performing and did complete tours with other entertainers. However, the specific conversations, emotional breakdowns, and private moments described here are fictionalized. This story attempts to honor the real friendship between these two men while imagining the emotional truth of that friendship's final chapter. Both Frank Sinatra and Dean Martin left extraordinary legacies, and this story is told with deep respect for both men and for the genuine bond they shared.